All phone participants are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session at the end of the conference. During that time, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star 1 and clearly record your name for question introduction. I would now like to turn the call over to your host, Ms. Sarah Lopez. You may begin. Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the NRC's informational meeting on New Reg 1927, Revision 1, Standard Review Plan for Renewal of Specific Licenses and Certificates of Compliance for Dry Storage of Spent Nuclear Fuel, Draft Report for Comment. The purpose of today's meeting is for the NRC staff to provide information on the proposed changes to Draft New Reg 1927. My name is Sarah, and I'm going to be facilitating today's meeting. I want to welcome the folks here in the room and they're here with us at NRC headquarters, and then also those who are joining us on the phone. As Michelle has said, Michelle is our conference call coordinator, your lines are in listen-only mode right now, but when we finish up with the NRC presentation, we'll be opening up those phone lines one at a time for you all to ask questions. Here in the room, the NRC staff will be going through a set of slides. For the folks on the phone, if you haven't already, you can access those slides on your computer at home if you have your computer up and running. The easiest way to get there is if you have access to our online meeting notice for this meeting. The link to where the slides can be found is on the second page of that meeting notice. The other way to get to those slides is to go to our NRC homepage, so www.nrc.gov, and then along the top of that page, you'll click on radioactive waste, and then click on storage of spent nuclear fuel. And on that page, about halfway down under the headline, How We Regulate, you can click on Public Involvement, and the slides and information that we're using here at the meeting is all on that Public Involvement page. You'll also find a link to Draft New Reg 1927 on that page if you want to pull up the new reg while we're talking about it. So for everybody here in the room, we're also going to have Draft New Reg on our laptop over there. So if you have comments that reference a specific page or section of the new reg, we'll be able to pull that up and put that on the screens up here for all of you. Before I hand the meeting over to Mark to provide an introduction and open the meeting, I'm going to cover our agenda and the brief ground rules for today's meeting. We'll start with an introduction by Mark Lombard, who's our Director of Division of Spent Fuel Management in the NRC's Office of Nuclear Materials Safety and Safeguards. Then we'll be followed by project managers Christina Banovic and Jennifer Davis, and they're going to review the proposed changes to Draft New Reg 1927. So following the NRC presentation, we'll then open the floor for your questions. So please hold your questions until the end of the NRC presentation. And then we'll be hearing from everybody one at a time, and we'll be moving from questions here in the room, which we'll give at these microphones here in the aisles, to questions on the phone. We'll be alternating back and forth so that we hear from everybody. The one thing that's very important to note about today's meeting is that this is an informational meeting. The NRC staff will not be accepting formal comments on Draft New Reg 1927 here today. We're not being transcribed or recorded or anything like that. The staff is going to be going over the proposed changes to Draft New Reg 1927, and they'll be answering your questions about those changes. But this is not the meeting to submit your formal comments. This isn't the forum to do that. Instead, that we hope that the information you get here today will inform your comments that you'll submit via regulations.gov or by mail. And the deadline to submit those comments online or by mail is August 21st. That's a Friday. And the details of how to submit those comments we're going to go over towards the end of this presentation, and there's also a handout here in the room that describes how you can submit your comments online or mail them. That information is also in the Federal Register notice as well. So there's plenty of time for today's comments and questions. The meeting will end promptly at 12 p.m., and our goal is to get through everybody at least once. Once we've heard from everybody once with their questions, we'll then go for subsequent rounds of questions. There'll be one 10-minute break or so about halfway through this meeting, so I will key that up. And feel free, obviously, to head out anytime you need to have a break, though. You don't need an escort here on the first floor of the NRC lobby area, so that's no problem. Handouts, I think most of you got them today. Please sign in if you haven't. There's a sign-in sheet for those of you in the room. The handouts are today's presentation, the Federal Register notice for the Draft New Reg, how to submit your comments. There's some information on safety culture. And there's also a card advertising our Division of Spent Fuel Management Regulatory Conference. It's a save-the-date card. So that conference is happening November 18th and 19th. And that's here at NRC headquarters in the 3 White Flint building. So save the date for that, and more information to come on that. And for those of you on the phone, if you go to the NRC where we post meetings typically, there's a link for conferences and symposia. I think if you click on that link, you'll find information for the RegCon 2015. All right, and now I'm going to hand the microphone over to Mark for the introduction.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it, and thank you for facilitating today. So as many of you know, we have approved 4 ISSC renewals, site-specific ISSC license renewals prior to 2012. We looked at those ISSC renewals and gleaned lessons learned from all those. We've had several discussions with interested members of the public and other stakeholders, including members of industry, over this last, 21-month period. Al came on board the fall of 2013, and one of the first, well, I think it might have been the second thing I said after I said, "Hey, how you doing? Welcome." And then I said, "By the way, you have a huge challenge ahead of you." And many of you heard me talk about this before, but Al and his team, led by Chris Banovac and by Jessie Quintero when she was taking over for you while you were on maternity leave, have done a great job of putting it together, and members of the team are here at the table and in the audience, so I want to commend them for the work that they've done. I also wanted to acknowledge the extensive collaboration that's gone on between us and industry. It's been a very good effort over this time frame, and we've resulted in a very good framework that we've put together. This framework, 1927 Rev 1, is the first formal piece of that framework, and we're very happy to have that out for public comment. Now the public comment period closes on August 21st of 2015, so we look forward to getting the comments. But this framework that it actually establishes is really the core of that framework is the aging management program, and the core of the aging management program is the inspections that are done, and having smart inspection techniques and reasonable acceptance criteria, having a learning aging management program that the aging management AMPs themselves describe is really the core of this moving forward. And also operating experience, having industry operating experience and being able to gather that and have a repository for that, having one place where you can go find all that operating experience is a good place, is a good idea. You know, obviously it's the core of the aging management program going forward to have that operating experience along with the inspections and the inspection techniques. So we look forward to the discussion today. We look forward to the comments that we receive prior to or on August 21st on the document and be able to move forward. It's, as I said, the first formal issuance that we have. It's a important piece of the framework going forward, and our intent with 1927, and I think you'll talk about the other elements, maybe touch on them today, or maybe respond to questions that people ask about them. Our intent is to continue to build a predictable, stable framework for renewals going forward, for ISSC renewals and COCs going forward. So with that, I also want to mention that the importance the NRC places on development and maintenance of a positive safety culture. There are some brochures over by the door where most folks came in to talk about our safety culture policy statement, and we want to encourage anyone who has safety concerns to bring them up to us either verbally or by email or using the website, on the public website for NRC. There's a link there that you can submit safety concerns. And I think Sarah's already introduced, she introduced Chris Banovac, who's going to lead our first presentation. And let's see, other folks here today are Al Santos, the branch chief. I mentioned him before. Daryl Dunn. Daryl Dunn is one of the triumvirate of materials engineer extraordinaire that we have here that have been working on this diligently for a long period of time. And not only the 1927 draft and the overall framework, but at the meantime, on their spare time, they were working on the Calvert Cliffs renewal and now the Prairie Island renewal and the VSC 24 renewal. So just a fantastic job done by the whole crew. So Daryl Dunn leads that off. Ricardo Torres and John Weiss, again, our triumvirate of folks within DSFM, our materials engineer extraordinaires. And from the Spent Fuel Licensing Branch is Michelle Sampson, the branch chief, and Jennifer Davis, senior project manager. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris, who's going to lead our first presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. And can everybody hear me in the room? Okay, great. Pleased to be here today to provide an overview of the changes that we're proposing to New Reg 1927, which we put forward for public comment in the draft revision 1. On slide 2, I'd first like to review NRC's requirements for renewal of independent spent fuel storage installations, specific licenses, and certificates of compliance or COCs for storage cask designs. The regulations in Part 72 allow for renewal of specific licenses and COCs for a period of up to 40 years, given that specific regulations that ensure that the storage casks will perform as designed in the period of extended operation are met. Applications must include time-limited aging analyses, or TLAAs, which consider the effects of aging on structure systems and components important to safety and assess their capability to continue to perform their intended functions in the period of extended operation. Renewal applications must also include a description of the Aging Management Program, or AMPS, for management of aging issues that could adversely impact structure systems and components important to safety. In addition, the renewal application must also include design basis information as documented in the most recently updated final safety analysis report. And in order for NRC to improve storage renewals, licensees need to demonstrate that any aging effects on dry storage systems can be safely managed and addressed so that those systems will continue to perform their intended functions in the period of extended operation. In February of 2011, we updated Part 72 to include these specific requirements, and we also issued accompanying guidance for the staff safety review of renewal applications, and that was issued in March 2011 in New Reg 1927 Revision 0. On slide 3, since the original issuance of New Reg 1927, as Mark had mentioned, we have had a few reviews, and through those reviews, we've identified that the guidance could be augmented in several areas, which we'll be touching on today. And we're also expecting to receive about 15 renewal applications within the next 10 years. And so to prepare for this wave of upcoming applications, we established an intra-agency storage renewal team to look at our current framework for spent fuel storage renewals and to determine what changes were needed, such as guidance development or guidance updates. As Mark mentioned, we started our work in late 2013, early 2014, and we did discuss the issues and the questions that arose during our renewal reviews. And we also reflected on and learned from the reactor renewal experience, and also research in corrosion and degradation mechanisms. We did identify a high priority need to update New Reg 1927, so that was our first thing we were tackling. But we also identified a need for development of additional guidance and other work, and you will be hearing more about that in the future as that work proceeds. On slide 4. So during the past year, we have had extensive stakeholder engagement on renewal topics. This slide lists some of those key meetings where we received valuable input from stakeholders, and this included a 2-day public meeting that we had last July, where we did talk about specific changes that we wanted to make to New Reg 1927. We also participated in various workshops and conferences and meetings in our efforts to improve our knowledge, capabilities, and assessments for addressing degradation modes for dry cask storage systems. We received valuable feedback at all of these meetings and in all of these exchanges, and we did consider all of that feedback in this draft guidance revision. On slide 5. This slide lists the structure and the format of the draft revision 1, which is for the most part consistent with revision 0. And since we did make updates and clarifications throughout the draft revision 1, we're going to highlight what some of those changes were and where they appear in the guidance. And then after the presentation, we look forward to any questions that you may have on the content in the draft revision 1. On slide 6. So I'll step through some of those changes that we made and where those appear. In Chapter 1, we did expand guidance on application content, particularly for COC renewals. We also added a section on timely renewal, and these timely renewal provisions are in Part 72, where if the applicant has submitted a timely application, the license or the COC does not expire until the time that the NRC makes a decision on that renewal application. We also added reviewer guidance for concurrent amendment and renewal applications and how aging management should be considered in those amendments, and also for amendment applications that are submitted after the renewal is issued and how that amendment needs to consider aging management. We also added reviewer guidance on the use of license or COC conditions to ensure that AMPS will remain effective throughout the period of extended operations. On slide 7, we also revised Chapter 2 on the scoping evaluation, and this is the part of the renewal application where the applicant identifies what structure systems and components are within the scope of the renewal, and therefore those are the SSCs that are reviewed for aging mechanisms and effects. We clarified sources of information and the specific content that supports the scoping evaluation. We expanded guidance for review of SSC subcomponents. We also added guidance for dry storage system internals. We expanded on the guidance that was there. And also expanded guidance on identifying SSCs within the scope of renewal. And for SSCs that are excluded from the scope of renewal, we added additional guidance for what would be a proper justification for excluding those from the scope of the renewal. On slide 8, so in Chapter 3, this is really where we made a bulk of the changes. This is the heart of New Reg 1927 in a way. It includes information on the aging management review, TLAs, and AMPs, and so we did make extensive changes throughout Chapter 3. The aging management review, that is the process that the applicant uses to assess the aging mechanisms and effects and to propose appropriate aging management activities to manage those aging mechanisms and effects. We expanded the guidance on identification of materials and environments for SSCs and SSC subcomponents. We added reviewer guidance for assessing environmental data such that the operating and service conditions for those SSCs can be properly determined. We also expanded the guidance on identification of aging mechanisms and effects to address valid sources of information for identifying applicable degradation modes, and that includes the use of lead system inspection results, site-specific and industry-wide operating experience, consensus codes and standards, and other applicable NRC guidance. On slide 9, so also in Chapter 3, we expanded discussion on aging management review for dry storage system internals. We revised the guidance on TLAAs to be consistent with the TLA definition that is in Part 72, and we also expanded the guidance for identification of TLAs and for reviewers. We also expanded the discussion on each of the 10 AMP elements. These 10 AMP elements were included in Revision 0. There was a brief explanation of the elements, but we really expanded on those in Revision 1, and we included the type of information that the reviewer should be looking for in the applications with regard to those 10 elements. We also provided new guidance on this idea of learning AMPs. And the thought is that a learning AMP continuously considers and responds to operating experience during the period of extended operation. So it would consider operating experience, any relevant confirmatory research, and any results of industry initiatives. And also any new technologies that are deployable or become deployable. For example, if there's any new tools or techniques for inspection or examination of dry cask storage systems. So we would expect the learning AMP to be able to respond to all of those things. The guidance also discusses how applications should include plans for future and periodic reviews of operating experience to make sure that that AMP is effective throughout the period of extended operation, or make any changes as is needed. On slide 10, so also in Chapter 3, more changes in Chapter 3, we did include a discussion of specific concepts that were proposed by industry in NEI 1403 Revision 0, which is titled Guidance for Operations-Based Aging Management for Dry Cask Storage. And this is a parallel effort by industry to develop guidance for renewal applicants. The two concepts that we talk about in the draft Revision 1 are the use of toll gates, which are periodic assessments of operating experience beyond the normal assessments of operating experience that happen through the licensee's quality assurance programs. And we also talk about aggregation and dissemination of operating experience across the industry through the use of an operating experience clearinghouse. Revision 1 does provide guidance to the reviewers for applications that may use or reference these concepts that are presented in NEI 1403 Revision 0. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we did expand the discussion on the aging management review for dry storage system internals, including discussion of high burn-up fuel. And so that consolidated the Revision 1 discussion, the Revision 0 discussion on retrievability. And then finally in Chapter 3, we did add some new guidance on commencement of AMPs for COC renewals, and that links to a new appendix that talks about storage terms for systems that are loaded under a COC. And we also added a new section on implementation of AMPs, and this considers licenses and COCs and timely renewal, and how that may impact the timing for development of the infrastructure for AMP implementation, like development of procedures, and also actual implementation of specific activities that may be outlined in the AMPs. So we did really make a lot of changes throughout Chapter 3. On slide 11, we did make some administrative changes and clarifications in the last couple chapters of the draft revision 1. We added a list of consolidated references that we used, and that's the new chapter 4. And we also moved the definitions which were in the front matter of revision 0. We moved that as a new chapter 5, and that's our glossary. And throughout the glossary, we did add some new definitions, and we also clarified some of the existing definitions to be more consistent with the definitions in Part 72. And also to be consistent with the definitions in our standard review plans for our review of initial applications for licenses and COCs, and that guidance appears in New Reg 1536 and 1567. So we tried to make those definitions consistent across the board. On slide 12, we also reviewed the appendices, the 5 appendices in revision 0. We kept Appendix A on non-quantifiable terms as is. We didn't make any changes there. However, we deleted the other 4 appendices. We found that those weren't very useful for the staff during our review process. But in their place, we did create some new appendices that we hope provides useful information for both the staff reviewers and for applicants. And those new appendices include the new Appendix B, and that includes 3 example AMPs related to spent fuel storage. We explored and expanded on this idea of the lead system inspection, which was only briefly touched on in revision 0, and that guidance is in the new Appendix C. In Appendix D, we incorporated guidance from Interim Staff Guidance, or ISG 24, and that was an ISG that was issued last year, and it provides guidance on the use of a high burn-up fuel surveillance program for monitoring fuel performance in the period of expended operation. In Appendix E, the new Appendix E, we included some information on considerations for COC renewals, and that includes a discussion on the responsibilities of the applicants, which are generally our COC holders, and the general licensees. And then finally in Appendix F, we provided information on storage terms for dry storage systems that are loaded under a COC, either in the initial period of that COC or in the renewal period of that COC. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Davis, and she's going to talk a little bit more in depth about the changes we're proposing in the appendices.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to skip Appendix A since that hasn't really changed since the initial issuance of 1927. So Appendix B is a new appendix, and it has 3 sample aging management programs that staff can reference as they conduct reviews. Each example goes through all 10 elements, and the elements are, just to refresh your memory, the first one is scope of program, the second one, preventive actions, the third one, parameters monitored or inspected, number 4 is detection of aging effects, number 5 is monitoring and trending, 6, acceptance criteria, 7, corrective actions, 8, confirmation process, 9, administrative controls, and 10 is operating experience. So, as I said, each example goes through all 10 elements and provides an example of what each element might contain. And we used consensus codes and standards where practicable to develop these sample AMPs. And again, they are simply an example, and the licensees, the applicants can propose other AMPs or other ways to address each element of the AMP. Slide 14. So the first one is the AMP for welded stainless steel canisters. And those are used in the majority of the dry storage systems in the U.S. We have no known occurrences of aging or localized corrosion in this type of canister, but some of the operating experience for reactors near oceans or bays has shown pitting corrosion, crevice corrosion, chloride-induced stress corrosion cracking can occur in welded stainless steel components. And so we've developed a sample AMP for looking at that.
So we base this on guidance and consensus standards and guides and the new reg reports, and also on the reactor operating experience and lab and field testing. And so one of the things we look at is the in-service inspection for localized corrosion and stress corrosion cracking, which is an example, in effect, of element 3, parameters monitored and inspected. Again, each sample AMP does address all 10 elements of an AMP. Slide 15. The second part, the second example in Appendix B is the reinforced concrete structures AMP, and that has identified aging effects evaluated against acceptance criteria derived from design basis or industry guides and standards, including the ones listed on the slide. So the elements that are listed, starting with visual inspection of above grade and below grade areas, each of these was identified in scoping, and then they're carried through in all of the elements as appropriate. So for example, visual inspections would be identified in scoping. More detail on how to do those is provided in parameters monitored and inspected. And then, for example, for the monitoring and trending element, you would look at any starting baseline cracks and then identify any crack growth rates and that kind of thing for monitoring. Slide 16, the final example AMP that we have provided is for high burnout fuel monitoring and assessment. And the purpose there is to monitor and assess data to confirm that degradation does not result in an unanalyzed fuel configuration during the period of extended operation. So we made this sample AMP more generic. It doesn't look, the first two AMPs are fairly similar. This one looks a little bit different than the corrosion or the reinforced concrete structures AMP. This one is more generic, and we've linked it to the design basis so that it is generically applicable to any site and any fuel. And it also looks a little bit different from the previous two because of the link to the surrogate demonstration program. However, the licensee or applicant can provide an argument on how their situation fits ISG 24 and how the data applies to their ISFSI. Slide 17. And on that slide, we're going to talk a little bit about ISG 24 as Appendix D. But first, in Appendix C is guidance for the lead system inspection, as Chris had mentioned. We have greatly expanded this since the initial issuance of 1927. So this determines the initial condition of the system to demonstrate that structures, systems, and components that have been determined to be within scope have not undergone unanticipated aging and degradation prior to the period of extended operation. So the guidelines for the lead system inspection were based on codes and standards where available, or the applicant can propose other bases for the lead system inspection. The use of surrogate inspections is not required, and there is only limited operating experience for those. So, and we do want to mention that lead system inspections for the COC renewals, we do recognize the difficulty in COC holders being able to perform those lead system inspections, but it is still their responsibility to provide information on those within the application. Slide 18 is Appendix D. Effectively, Appendix D provides the ISG 24 that Chris had mentioned before within 1927, and that is use of a demonstration program as a surveillance tool for confirmation of integrity of high burnup fuel during the period of extended operation. We recognize that the list of ISGs on the public website has an old listing for ISG and so that link doesn't give you the actual ISG, but we can provide the ML number for the actual ISG if anyone wants it. But again, Appendix D is effectively that ISG incorporated into 1927. And that gives staff a basis for reviewing if the demonstration project has the necessary properties to qualify as one method that an applicant might use in the license and COC renewal applications